Live to Facebook. So please keep yourselves muted, and also please keep off your cameras. It does help increase the quality of the presentation. Before I hand it off to the presenter tonight, I just wanted to introduce our organization briefly. For those of you that are not familiar with the Friends of Neat Tarts Bay webs, we are a small nonprofit that works on the Oregon coast. Our area ranges from Cape Mears to Cape Lookout. And we work to sustain this area through stewardship and education. We fundraise through private donations as well as grants to bring free learning opportunities like tonight's presentation to our community. In a non-pandemic time, we would typically take you out in the field if possible, and we hope to get back to that in the coming months. We also fundraise to bring free education programs to our youth, and we offer a handful of K through 12 STEM-based education programs to our schools. We are also engaged in a lot of community science projects, encouraging our community members to get involved in helping scientists learn more about our coastal areas. We think it's important that we can aid in that scientific discovery and learn about this place that we live in together. So for tonight's presentation, what we ask is, for logistics wise, what we ask is that if you have any questions at all, that you use the chat function to ask your questions. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to stop my sharing and I'm going to introduce our presenter for tonight. And I'm going to let her start sharing. I see her joined right here. Tonight's presenter is Rebecca Mostow, a PhD candidate and NSF graduate research fellow at Oregon State University, where she is advised by Dr. Sally Hacker. Rebecca's research is on a novel hybrid zone between two non-native grasses, and she has earned awards and funding from the National Science Foundation, the Washington Native Plant Society, and the Society for Integrative and Comparative Biology. She has a bachelor's in biology and has completed projects on desert plant systems in the past. Prior to joining her, starting her graduate degree, she has conducted research and taught at Port Townsend Marine Science Center, Alaska Maritime National Wildlife Refuge, and for the Bureau of Land Management. Thank you so much for joining us tonight. We're very excited to hear about your research and your work. For us personally, we are also trying to dive into mapping projects to help state parks map where non-native invasive plants are. So this is totally in our wheelhouse of interest. So I'm really excited to welcome you here today for this presentation.
Great. Yeah, thanks so much for having me. And thanks to you all for joining us, at least virtually. It's great to see all of your names on the screen, even if we can't be out on the dunes together. So my name is Rebecca Mostow, and I am a PhD candidate at Oregon State University. And the research that I'm going to present to you today is part of the dissertation work that I'm doing at OSU in the Department of Integrative Biology. So the title of the talk today is Hybrid in a Haystack, using crowdsourced science to map a newly discovered ecosystem engineering hybrid beachgrass. So here's the story that I'm going to tell today. It's the story of an unexpected discovery that has been unfolding on the Oregon coast dunes for the past about 8 years. And we're going to go through the story. We're going to start with this cast of characters who's involved in this discovery. And then we'll talk a little bit about Pacific Northwest dune natural history, although maybe we should call that dune unnatural history, right? Because most of the plants I'm going to talk about today are non-native species. Then we'll talk briefly about the botany of desire, by which I mean hybridization in plants and why it happens and what's going on there. Don't come at me, Michael Pollan. And then we'll get to this unexpected discovery, which is the discovery of a hybrid on the Pacific Northwest dunes. And we'll talk about the consequences of that discovery, next steps, and how you can be involved in sort of furthering our understanding of this new hybrid. I'm going to continue to mess around with my screen a little bit. Here we go. Okay, before we go any further, I do want to take a quick poll. How many people have read the book Dune? You can just put it, either you could, if you're a participant in Zoom, you can put it, you can just raise your hand and then I can see that you've raised your hand. Or if you don't know how to do that, you can just put a yes or a no in the chat. And while people are figuring out how to respond to my question, I'll tell you that Dune is like this classic sci-fi book that's all about the dunes of this planet that's covered in dunes. And it was inspired, Frank Herbert, the author, lived in Oregon and he traveled out to the Oregon coast dunes. And he was like, wow, this ecosystem is so weird. I can imagine like an entire world like this would be extremely cool and weird to write about. And so he wrote an entire book. Okay, it looks like there's a couple people who have read Dune. Okay, I'm gonna take out all of my jokes about sandworms and spice and rockets and all those things. No more Dune jokes. Okay, moving on. So now we're into this cast of characters part. So a brief introduction to me. I grew up in Seattle, Washington, and then I moved to Ohio to study biology at Oberlin College. And I've always been something of a scientific omnivore, as you maybe got from the introduction. I studied plant phylogenetics and seabird ecology and kelp reproduction, among other things. And I also spent a year working at the Port Townsend Marine Science Center before starting my PhD at OSU. And pretty much my whole time at the PTMSD, I looked like this picture here, where I spent most of my time with my head in a fish tank when I was supposed to be putting fish into a fish tank. But I also got a chance to interact with community scientists or citizen scientists. And I realized sort of the value of community science and for connecting people with the ecosystems that they live in, but also the value of community scientists for collecting really important data on biodiversity. Okay, another really important character to introduce you to is, of course, Dr. Sally Hacker. Sally is my advisor at Oregon State University, so I'm going to make no jokes about her. She's a coastal community ecologist, an amazing scientist, and if you hear me talk about sort of the way that grasses build dunes, all of that research is coming out of Sally's lab. And then finally, I just want to say that science is a team sport. This is a picture of just some of the many people who I've been lucky enough to work with on this project and during my PhD. So they're undergrads, they're grad students, they're land managers, they're professors and postdocs. There's a couple of people I want to point out. One of them is Peter Ruggiero, who's right here. Peter is a professor in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences at Oregon State. And he studies the way that he studies dunes and coastal hazards. And he actually, I think on Tuesday was on, I heard him on Think Out Loud on OPB. So if you heard anybody, any scientists talking about coastal hazards a couple of days ago on the radio, that was Peter. So when you hear me talking about dune shape, just know that's coming out of the Ruggiero lab. And then another person to point out is Felipe Barretto, who's right here. Felipe is another professor at Oregon State. And if you hear me talking about genetics, genome size, genotyping, any of those things, that's work that I've done in Felipe's lab. Okay, so those are the people involved. And now it's time to talk about some natural history. So this black and white picture in the background is the native sort of natural state of the Pacific Northwest dunes. Up until around the early 1900s, this is what it would look like if you went out to the coast, say like Bay Ocean Spit, right? There's these low, nonlinear dunes that are sparsely vegetated, but vegetated by a wide diversity of plants. And it's a really dynamic system, constantly sand shifting and moving. And I'm highlighting just some of the beautiful native plants that grow on the dunes and grew on the dunes then. So the pros of this world, right, is that there's high species plant diversity, but there's like lots of shifting sand all the time, which in the early 1900s, European settlers moved to the Oregon and Washington coasts, and the shifting sand was starting to be a big problem for them. So they introduced 2 non-native beach grasses that built these tall, linear, densely vegetated, and really stable dune systems. And this is what the Oregon coast looks like now. And just to give you a sense of the scale of the change that we're talking about, on the left, I have sort of pre-beachgrass introduction photos, and then on the right, post-introduction photos. And what I want you to notice is that on the left, we have all this white, open, shifting sand, and this Pacific city. And then on the right, there's all this green, right? There's these long linear foredunes, and there's not as much open sand. And the other thing to notice is that the beach is not just densely vegetated now, but it's also densely populated. And that dense population, human population, is facilitated by the spread of these beach grasses. So unfortunately, the beach grasses that were introduced, they spread outside of the areas where they were originally planted, and they've come to really dominate the Oregon and Washington coast dunes. These beach grasses increase coastal protection, so they basically build almost like a living seawall that protects communities built behind them. They also increase the stand stability on the coast. However, they also decrease plant species richness. They outcompete native plants and decrease plant species richness, and they decrease habitat for native animals and plants, including the western snowy plover, which is threatened, and I'm showing here the pink sand verbena, which is state endangered. So there's these positive impacts of the introduction of the beach grasses for human development and negative consequences for biodiversity management. So what I haven't really mentioned yet is that there were actually two species of beach grass introduced to the Pacific Northwest. One is Ammophila arenaria, or European beach grass, and the other is Ammophila breviligulata, or American beach grass. And Ammophila arenaria, European beach grass, was predominantly planted in the south, so from the Columbia River south through Oregon and into California. And Ammophila breviligulata, American beach grass, was predominantly planted in the north, so from about the Columbia River north through the Washington coast. These two closely related species of grass actually have differential effects on dune morphology, so the shape of the dunes, coastal protection, and biodiversity. So for the next part of the talk, we're just going to zero in on those two species and think about the differential impacts that they have. All right, so on the left, we have Ammophila arenaria, European beach grass, which is invasive in Oregon, but native to Western Europe. And then on the right, we have Ammophila breviligulata, American beach grass, which is invasive in Oregon, but native to the US Northeast and Midwest. And the easiest way to tell these two sort of closely related grasses apart is to look at the ligule. The ligule is this thin piece of tissue between the leaf blade and the stem. So if you look at these illustrations right here, this is where the ligule is. It's just at the intersection of the blade and the stem. The way I like to think about it, honestly, is like the armpit hair of the grass. You can imagine that the grass is like going like this and like look at its armpits, and that is where the ligule is. Ammophila arenaria has a long pointy ligule, has long armpit hair, and then Ammophila breviligulata has short, flat ligule, armpit hair. I hope that's helpful for people. A quick aside about common names and Latin names. So the common names for these grasses are confusing. These are called beach grasses, but they grow on the dunes. There's one called American beach grass, but it's native to the East Coast and the Midwest of North America, but not native here. So I find the common names confusing, and you'll see we have a native grass with a very similar common name. But a fun thing about the Latin names, if you're into that kind of thing, is that Ammophila, so amo is Greek for sand, and phila is Greek for lover. So these are sand-loving plants. And then breviligulata, brevi is short and ligulata is liguled. So this is Ammophila breviligulata is the short liguled sand-loving plant. And arenaria is Latin for sand. So Ammophila arenaria is just like sand-loving in Greek and then sandy in Latin. That's my Latin aside for the day. I hope everyone enjoyed it. All right, so these are the two different species of grasses and sort of how you can tell them apart. Maybe a helpful way to remember them. All right, so the two species, they look similar and they build different shaped dunes. So Ammophila arenaria builds taller, steeper dunes, and it builds those dunes because of a positive feedback loop between grass growth and sand deposition. So Ammophila arenaria grows more densely, and that feeds back to build these taller, steeper dunes. Ammophila arenaria dominated dunes also tend to have higher plant species richness than those dominated by Ammophila breviligulata. And this is work coming out of the Hacker Lab. Now there's one more species of grass I just want to mention, because if you go out on the beaches, you might notice it, and that is Lamus mollis, American dune grass. So this is the confusing common name, right? Lamus mollis, you can tell apart. It grows way less densely than the Ammophila beach grasses. It has much thicker leaf blades and stems. It's got kind of a greeny blue color to it. And it builds these low, hummocky, the natural system, right? Dunes, not dense, tall dunes, with these widely spaced stems, really high plant species richness. And these dunes offer something that the Ammophila dunes never can, which is high habitat value. And here's our little western snowy plover down there in the bottom. All right, so all of the things that I summarized thus far are discoveries that have come out of the Hacker Lab, primarily by conducting these long-term monitoring of dune shape and plant community composition on the Pacific Northwest coast. And so each of the triangles in this map here represent a site where every 3 years, somebody from our lab returns to that site and surveys dune shape and plant community. And they do that by walking over the dunes, carrying a special GPS backpack. And that backpack tells you not just where you are in space, but how high you are, so what your elevation is. And from that GPS, we can get sort of a profile of what the shape of the dune looks like. And we get a lot of questions about whether or not we're beaming up to aliens, which I love. And then somebody else will walk along and use quadrats and just count the number of plants, identify every plant and count how many of them there are along the dune. And so from these data sets, we can understand the relationship between the shape of the dune and the plants that are growing on it. And it was actually during one of these surveys in 2012 that the story that I'm trying to tell you today really began. So Ruben Beal, a lab mate of mine, was out on the dune surveying, and he found this plant, this weird looking plant that looked a little bit like Ammophila breviligulata. It had wider leaf blades, and it looked a little bit like Ammophila arenaria. It had a longish ligule, but not that long. It was also the only plant that was flowering on the dune. And Ruben looked at this plant, this sort of weird looking thing, and said, could this grass be a hybrid? Is this a hybrid between the two Ammophila species? And so that question, is this beach grass a hybrid? That has sort of taken away a huge chunk of my PhD, has been devoted to answering that question. So before we get into figuring out the answer, let's just take an aside to think about hybridization. So a hybrid is the offspring of parents from two different species. So not this, right? But this. A mule is a hybrid between a horse and a donkey. A liger, thanks Tiger King for introducing everyone to ligers. Now we all know what hybrids are. A liger is a hybrid between a lion and a tiger. But these are animals, right? And there are actually lots of plant hybrids, some that you probably see in the grocery store. So a pluot is a hybrid, a tangelo is a hybrid. And all the things that I showed you just there, those are artificial hybrids. But actually hybridization in nature is fairly common and totally natural. There are some groups that are studied as like they just love to hybridize, like sunflowers. There's some salamanders that hybridize a lot. And grasses actually tend to hybridize quite a bit. So the meat of the talk of what I'm going to get into today is answering these three questions. The first one is just sort of these three questions that we're using to sort of investigate this new weird looking plant that Ruben found on the dunes, right? The first question is this plant a hybrid? And the second question is, can it sexually reproduce? That's a question that's really important for hybrids. You might know just from knowing from animals that lots of hybrids are sterile, and that can limit how far they can spread and also how invasive they can be when we think about invasive plants. So understanding the sexual reproduction is important. And then the third question is how much is out there? So if this is a hybrid and if we know that it might be spreading, then how much is out there and where is it? Okay, so the methods that I used to answer these questions are we looked at sort of the genotype and the genome size and what the plant looked like to assess whether it's a hybrid. To understand its sexual reproduction, we looked at flowering time and seed production. And to understand how much of the hybrid is out there, we're using community and crowdsourced science. All right, so now we're going to go through each of these questions one at a time, starting with, is it a hybrid? So the first thing we looked at was the morphology of the plant, just what does it look like, and how does that compare to the parent species? So we collected hundreds of plants and measured a suite of traits. Some of those traits are important for plant identification, and some are important for actually dune building potential. Remember that I told you that the two parent species build different shaped dunes, and they're differently shaped because of the way the plants grow. So understanding how the hybrid grows can maybe tell us a little bit about what kind of dunes it might build. So we measured the suite of traits. One of them was ligule length. So remember I showed you that armpit hair of the grasses, right? So on the x-axis here we have species, and on the y-axis is ligule length. The first species is Ammophila arenaria. Remember I told you it had a long skinny ligule, and we're seeing that in the data. The next is the hybrid. It has this medium length ligule. And then the last one is Ammophila breviligulata, amber, and it has AMBR. It has a short flat top ligule. All right, so here's a trait that the hybrid is intermediate between the parents, and that might be helpful for identifying it out in the field. Another trait that we found that was intermediate is the width of the leaves of the plants. However, when we measured shoot height, the height from the very base of the plant to the very tip of it, we found that the hybrid was actually taller than either parent species, which can tell us a little bit about what kinds of dunes it might build, that it might be able to accrete or accumulate more sand than the parent species. And the last trait I'll show you is the number of shoots per plant, which can tell us a little bit about the density, how dense it grows. And again, we found that the hybrid was intermediate, although not statistically differentiable from Ammophila breviligulata, American beachgrass. All right, so the hybrid looks different from the parent species. We can quantify those differences. The next thing we did was look at the genome size. So just how much DNA does the plant have? How many chromosomes does it have, really? And we found that the hybrid has almost exactly intermediate genome size when compared to the parent species. This is pretty compelling evidence that what we're seeing is a first generation hybrid cross between the two species. And this genome size estimation was done in the lab of Dr. Ryan Contreras at OSU. Next, we did some genotyping. So we actually sequenced some of the DNA in the plants, and I fed it into a computer program that sorts the different individuals, which are represented as columns in this graph, into different groups that are represented as colors. So the computer program here is saying that all of the Ammophila arenaria individuals or columns, they belong in the red group. All the Ammophila breviligulata individuals belong in the blue group. And then the hybrid, the computer program is saying that each individual belongs half in the Ammophila breviligulata group and half in the Ammophila arenaria group. So again, this is really compelling evidence that this is in fact, what we're seeing is in fact a hybrid, and it's a first generation cross. And I'm happy to report that all of the data that I've presented thus far is in press at Ecosphere. Should be out any day now. All right, so we answered the question, is it a hybrid? Yes, it is a hybrid. And we're very excited to know that finally. So the next question is, can this hybrid sexually reproduce? And so to understand that, the first thing I did was survey the flowering time, so when the grasses are flowering. And this is what the grass flowers look like if you've never been out on the dunes and sneezed a bunch and noticed them. We have Ammophila arenaria flowers and Ammophila breviligulata flowers here growing right next to each other. And what I did is I visited 4 sites along the Oregon coast every 2 weeks for the entire flowering season of the 2 parent species. And I surveyed the number of flowering stalks when I visited. So here on the x-axis is the date of my survey, and on the y-axis is the number of, the density of flowering stalks that I found. Here I'm showing just Ammophila arenaria flowering stalks in red. So the peak flowering time for Ammophila arenaria was around early July. Now I'll add the Ammophila breviligulata flowering. So peak flowering for Ammophila breviligulata happened around sort of late August. And then if I add the hybrid, you can see that the hybrid has an overlapping flowering time with both parent species, and it has a different peak. So that peak flowering time was around mid-July. So there's some pretty exciting stuff in here that I'll break down for you. The first is just understanding the rate of hybridization. So how likely is it that these 2 species, Ammophila arenaria and Ammophila breviligulata, will hybridize? If we just look at their overlap, there's just a small period of time when both species are flowering out on the dunes. And so it's interesting that they were able to that they were able to hybridize. And it suggests that they will be able to continue to hybridize in the future, right? That they have still this overlap where their flowers are open and they could cross-pollinate. Another thing to think about is the peak of the hybrid. We can see that the hybrid overlaps in its flowering with both parent species, leaving the possibility for back crossing, so the hybrid being pollinated or pollinating its parent species. It's also really important for identification of the hybrid that it has a different flowering time than the parent species. What we found is that if we go out onto the dunes in early to mid-July up and down the coast, we can identify the hybrid much more easily just by picking out the flowers that are just coming up. So this could be an important tool for people trying to search for the hybrid. Okay, moving on. That's flowering time. The next piece of the reproduction that we wanted to look at was seed production. And this is work that is being done by an undergraduate in our lab, Mackenzie Barker, who is just an incredible student who has put in a ton of work into this project. And what she's done is that 2 years, 2018 and 2020, she went out to the coast and collected hybrid panicles or inflorescences, those flowering stalks that have all the little tiny flowers on them. And she collected flowers from up and down the range of the hybrid. 2018, she collected almost 140, and in 2020, she collected 150. And then she takes those flowering stalks and breaks them apart and tries to find as many seeds as she can. So she looks into each of the individual little tiny flowers and sees if there's a seed in here. So the middle picture is what it looks like. Each of those columns there is 100 seeds. And so she's sorting through hundreds of seeds from an individual inflorescence, trying to figure out, are there any seeds in this panicle? And what she found is she found 5 developed seeds in 2018 and 5 developed seeds in 2020. This was really exciting discovery for her, that there was this potential that the hybrids were actually setting seeds out on the dunes. But we thought, well, okay, seeds can develop but not have viable embryos in them. And so we did a TZ test, which is a way of testing for the viability of seeds. And she found viable embryos in her seeds. That's what I'm showing in this last photo, is what it looks like when you stain those seeds for viable tissue. So this is really compelling evidence that the hybrid has this reproductive potential and can possibly produce seeds that could germinate out on the dune. These grasses spread mostly asexually, the 2 parent species. They spread with these sort of underground stems called rhizomes. So we know that the hybrid doesn't need to be able to sexually reproduce to make its area a little bit bigger at a time. But if the hybrid were to be able to set seeds and then have those seeds land in different places and start newer sort of patches of the hybrid, that is an interesting development. Obviously, we need to do more research here to fully understand the consequences of this, but this is really exciting, unpublished and new work for us. All right. So the next step, we know that there's a hybrid. We have some questions about how it's reproducing. The next step is to ask how much of this hybrid is out there. So when I joined the lab in 2016, there were 4 known hybrid sites. And so I'm showing you the overlap between the 2 parent species in northern Oregon and southern Washington. I'm kind of zooming in on that area where both of those 2 species occur and showing the 4 sites that we knew a hybrid existed. In 2017, we started looking for the hybrid a little bit more. I started searching the beaches for it. And one of our sites eroded down in southern Grayland, but then I found a couple more sites. So we increased the number that we had. And then in 2018 and 2019, I started to search a little bit harder and we found even more sites. What you might notice is that there's some big gaps on the map, and I realized that I was searching on my own trying to find the hybrid, and really this was not something I could do alone. I needed to enlist some help. And so what I did, here's some place names. What I did was I teamed up with the folks from the Oregon Shores Conservation Coalition to start a community crowdsourced science project, where basically the goal of the project is to train volunteers to be able to identify the hybrid beachgrass. And then whenever they happen to go out to the dunes, they can poke around, see what they see, upload their observation of the hybrid or either parent species to iNaturalist, which I'll explain in a moment, and help us understand the ranges of the parent species and of the hybrid. So the first thing I just want to ask is how many people have actually used iNaturalist? If you could put into the in the chat just like a yes or no, throw me a yes or no if you've used iNaturalist. We'll do a quick survey. While people are answering, I'll just say that iNaturalist is a social network with the goals of connecting people to nature and generating scientifically valuable biodiversity data. Okay, I've gotten a couple no's, so that means I'm going to explain the whole thing. Thank you all. So it just so happens that like those are my goals too, right? Like my number one goal is to connect people to the ecosystems that they live in. And so working with iNaturalist seems like a great fit for me. So the way iNaturalist works is basically you as a user can upload observations of any living thing. This is my pandemic puppy barking in the background. I hope that this is not unprofessional, but humanizing, perhaps. Hopefully he'll stop. Hey, Wally. Wally, that's enough. Wally dog. Come here, bud.
Sounds adorable.
He's extremely cute. Here you go, Wally. You do this. Excuse me. Okay, so as I was saying, on iNaturalist, you can upload an observation of any living thing. And the way you can think about it is like if one person uploads an observation of like a robin, for example, that's like not that useful of a piece of information, right? But if I upload a picture of a robin and then one other person comes on and says, well, actually, that's not a robin, that's a towhee. Like they look at my photo and they say, not a robin. And then the third person comes in and they agree, oh yeah, that's a towhee. And then they also submit a photo of a towhee. What we can end up with is not just sort of random points, but something that looks more like the picture that I'm showing here, which is a range map, right? This is a range map of marram grasses or Ammophila beach grasses that is really just all of the observations of these grasses all over the world. It's an amazing tool for learning the natural world around you because you can upload observations and then your community members can be like, yes or no, whatever. But it's also an amazing tool for scientists for gathering data about where our species are. So a couple other things to think about with iNaturalist is basically you log on, you submit an observation, and then other people can agree or disagree. And if lots of people agree that it is what it is, that makes the observation more sound and more scientifically valuable. And if 3 people agree, an observation is research grade. And that's when scientists like me can use it. So what I've done is I've built a project page on iNaturalist. And basically this page just pulls in observations from all of iNaturalist users. And they're all the observations of the 2 Ammophila parent species and the hybrid up and down the West Coast. And so whenever anybody identifies one of these grasses, I get a little notification and I can go in and say yes or no. And the project page also has a ton of information about the beach grass. Including an ID guide that I built that's linked in the project page. So the ID guide has information about the same stuff that I told you about the Ligue length, ranges, it has identification tips, and it also has sort of a how to use iNaturalist. So we rolled out this iNaturalist project last spring, and I'm sure you can imagine that it did not go exactly as planned, right? We had planned all these sort of in-person trainings and it just didn't quite go as we had hoped. However, we were able to get some community engagement, and I'm happy to say this was our old map and this is our new map. It's maybe hard to see those new little dots popping up, but this little gold one here was actually discovered by an iNaturalist user. So I'm feeling really excited about the ability of this project to engage people in searching for the hybrid, and actually provide really valuable scientific biodiversity data. As we're looking at this map, I'll just take a brief moment to say, you might notice this large gap here between Sunset Beach and Pacific City. I would really, really like people to be searching the beaches here in this area. And you might know that like Tarts is right in there, right? So that's like Cape Lookout, Spit, Bay Ocean Spit, Halem Bay, Manzanita, those areas. They're really long beaches, and I tried to search them myself, and I am just only one person and I couldn't do it. So if you're interested in this, I'm going to do another plug at the end, but please do get in touch. I would love to give you more information to help you identify the grasses that are on the beaches that you just happen to be going to already. Okay, so the answer to how much how much of this hybrid is out there is lots, but we need more data, and you can help us collect that data. And yeah, I mentioned just moments ago that I would love more people to be involved, and I'm actually hosting some in-person on the dunes trainings through Coast Watch. The first one is going to be May 8th from 10 to noon at Bob Straub State Park in Pacific City. And the next one will be May 29th at Port Stevens State Park, 10 a.m. to noon. So if you're interested in coming to either of those trainings, just RSVP straight to me. I'm going to put right now the iNaturalist webpage. Oh, I'll do it at the end, actually. I'm going to put the iNaturalist webpage and my email into the chat so that everyone can have it. Great. All right. So in conclusion, what did we learn? We discovered that the Ammophila beach grasses are hybridizing along the Pacific Northwest coast. And we found this Ammophila hybrid at over 17 different sites along the coast. And we know that it can sexually reproduce. So there are some pretty big potential consequences when we consider this reproduction, this hybridization event, right? The first thing for us to think about is, of course, coastal protection. So these grasses were intentionally introduced in order to stabilize dunes and provide coastal protection to built behind them. We don't know how the Ammophila hybrid will impact dune shape and therefore its coastal protection value. We have some evidence that the hybrid grows more densely and is taller than the parent species, which would indicate that it might build taller dunes, but we really need more information to understand the impact of the hybrid on coastal protection. The next question is biodiversity conservation. So these grasses are not native, right? And they've spread dramatically on the Pacific Northwest coast. And we don't know what the impact of this hybrid will be on the biodiversity. We don't know how it will interact with native plants and threatened and endangered plants, as well as the threatened shorebirds, this western snowy plover. The next question is really about the population genetics of the parent species. So I sort of alluded to this, but I showed you that the hybrid, the flowers at the same time as its parent, as both parent species. And so this raises the specter of backcrossing, of the hybrid being able to sexually reproduce with its parent species. If that's possible, the hybrid could facilitate gene flow between the two parents, which could change the population genetics of the Ammophila parent species. That might seem like a weird esoteric thing to be thinking about, like why does gene flow between species matter? But we're talking about two extremely aggressive invasive plants that have taken over large areas of our coastline. And changes in population genetic diversity, especially increases in population genetic diversity, have been shown to increase invasiveness in plants. So messing around with the gene pool of the parent species is an unsettling, if not dangerous game. The next final potential consequence is about the ecological consequences of the spread of the hybrid. So how will the hybrid interact with the parent species? By this, I mean like, if the hybrid is growing next to Ammophila breviligulata, is it going to outcompete Ammophila breviligulata and spread into that area? Or is it maybe it would facilitate Ammophila breviligulata, somehow provide it with resources to help it grow bigger and stronger? We don't know how the hybrid is interacting with the parent species. And we do know that any change in dominant beachgrass on the Pacific Northwest coast will have cascading impacts on coastal protection and that biodiversity management piece. So I'm actually in the middle of a project investigating the ecological interactions between the hybrid and the parent species. I've built a common garden species interaction experiment at the Hatfield Marine Science Center in Newport, Oregon, where basically I'm growing the parent species and the hybrid together. Basically, it's like a plant face-off. They're growing in the same space, and we're going to see which one grows bigger, which one wins. So with that, I have a lot of people to thank. I want to thank, there's a lot of people who have been involved in this research, including people who have been involved in fieldwork and grass measuring. Most of our research is conducted on the traditional homelands of the Clallam, Makah, Quileute, Chinook, Tillamook, Siletz, and Nistika people. So there's an immense debt of gratitude owed there, of course. And then finally, we have funding for this project from a number of sources, including Oregon Sea Grant, without whom the interaction experiment would not be possible, as well as some continued genetic work. The National Science Foundation, Hatfield Marine Science Center, the Washington Native Plant Society, the Society for Integrative and Comparative Biology, and the Integrative Biology Department at OSU. Okay, so with that, I'm going to close and I'm happy to take any questions. And I'm going to throw these links down here into the chat. Oh, and your questions can go in the chat.
Awesome. Thank you, Rebecca. That was super fascinating to me. Like Rebecca said, any questions you have, please do put them in the chat. And we will ask them. I know that earlier today we got some folks that were quite happy about you sharing I'm gonna butcher the name, the Ligulas as armpit hair. That is it's actually quite easier to say armpit hair, so I might just carry that one forward.
Exactly.
Gotta check the armpit hair link.
Yeah, no, I do. Exactly. Check the armpit hair.
That's
so
great.
I just put the iNaturalist link into the chat, as well as my email address, which is up here as well. Thank you, Roger, for saying that my dog is adorable.
Roger knows all about dogs invading presentation spaces. We get to see his occasionally as well. I also wanted to say that on the iNaturalist site, you also have a pamphlet that kind of shares some of this information in an easy to grab spot. So a lot of this it's a pamphlet, or it's for a mobile version. It's just a really nice reminder of all of the kind of key ID things that we went over tonight. So you can definitely find that on the iNaturalist link.
Yeah, that ID guide is linked in the About section of the iNaturalist project page, and you can download it, and there's a version, that works on your phone, and a version that's easier to print out.
Perfect. Yeah, so I have a question here from Roger. Which of the two non-hybrid beach grasses are most prevalent on Tart spit?
Great question. Yeah, I was hoping we could talk a little bit more with our extra time about, your particular area. So the dominant beachgrass in your area is Ammophila arenaria, or European beachgrass. However, I do know that Ammophila breviligulata is out there. I recently saw it on Bay Ocean spit, and I know that it's on Cape Lookout spit. So I assume that it's, the Ammophila breviligulata is out there, but the dominant grass is Ammophila arenaria. And so that's going to be growing densely. And then if you're looking to see what else is out there, you should look for grasses that are growing slightly less densely, and maybe look have wider leaf blades, maybe look a little like fluffier and juicier and less like dry and stabby than the ones around them. And that could be Ammophila breviligulata.
Awesome. And then there's definitely the the American dune grass.
Yes,
Speckled
yeah,
elm.
and you have our native dune grass. Yeah, American dune grass, Lamus mollis.
So another question we have is, would you expect to see the hybrid closer to trails or deep in the monoculture away from the trails?
Oh, what a good question. There are a number of factors that affect where the hybrid is going to be on the dunes. Let me see if I have my little photo that is helpful for this, to think about this. Oh yeah. So there's a couple of things to think about. The first thing is, where are hybrids being produced? And the second thing is, where are hybrids being found? So those are kind of two different things, right? Where they're being produced is about like where the grasses are flowering and producing seeds. And where they're being found has a lot more to do with where I walk or you walk, right? So one amazing thing about the beach grasses is that they really need sand deposition to grow. They need sand to be blown on them, and to have it sort of land on their bases and to help them sort of build up and grow. They're stimulated by sort of the weight of it, but there's nutrients loaded on the outside of those sand grains that act as a fertilizer for them. So the beach grasses flower most at the very toe of the dune, so it's closest to the water, and then at the crest of the dune, the highest point. And this picture is just showing you, this is Rylea, I think, just showing you that there's a ton of flowering happening, and then there's sort of a line where when you go back from there, there's just not as much sand deposition happening, and so there's less flowering. So we would expect to see more hybrids being produced in an area where there's more flowering happening. So that might not be like on trails necessarily, but if your trail goes over the crest of the dune to go down to the beach, start looking when you get to the crest and then as you're getting down to the toe. The other thing that I've noticed is that we are mostly finding the hybrid at the toe of the dune. So closest to the ocean, at the area where the dune is like just starting to build up. That might be because that's where the hybrid is being produced because of where the grasses are flowering. But it also could just be because like that's where I walk, right? I don't like trudge through the deep monoculture just for fun, right? I walk on the toe of the dune and then I cut up into the dunes. And so it might be that it's just easier to find it down there. So if you were going to go poke around for the hybrid, I would say areas where you found both species, that's like the key to finding it. And then walking on the toe of the dune is a lot easier because you'll be able to sort of pick out those flowering stems if you go at the right time.
That's really interesting. I know that there are places nearby, like Wayland Island, or where you can see at least the European beach grass and the dune grass nestled right next to each other. So that's really interesting when you can kind of see the two spots together combining. I'm wondering what's there. You know, we went out to that location with Celeste, who's a botanist that you know, Celeste. And we talked about that area being a weed-free island, which would be really an awesome thing to see, right?
Wow.
So felt like it could be achieved in that spot, which is really great. And so if anybody on this call has not been out to Clay Myers, Wayland Island, here locally, it's a really great example of what a system could be like, and what the natural plant systems would be like. So it's a really neat place.
That is really cool.
Yeah, it's definitely worth a visit.
Yeah.
What's the like you talked about the burial of some of these plants? What's the longevity? Like how long can a plant survive? How long can the seeds survive? You know, like Scotch broom, we hear these like they can survive for 30 years buried and still germinate. Like do we know much about that for these types of grasses in the hybrid?
This is a really good question. And I'm going to cop out and not really answer it because the literature disagrees. Some people find in some systems that these grasses, the Ammophila beach grasses, produce a lot of seed and that it lasts a really long time and that it's really deep into the dunes and still viable. Other people find the grasses don't produce a lot of seed and that it's really kind of wimpy and goes away really quickly and gets eaten by things. So I find that the literature, that there's not a clear answer to that question at this point. I think what makes studying these plants fascinating but also challenging is that the Ammophila beachgrasses are invasive in many places. So they're native to not here, and they're also invasive in not here. And so studying them it's so context dependent. It's so dependent on what dune they happen to be on. But yeah, that question of like how long could, like, we're finding 5 hybrid seeds a year or something. Or is there any chance that those seeds are actually like landing and germinating and being, we don't really know the answer to that.
One more question came in. Do drifting rhizomes play a role in dispersal after winter storms? So as things kind of get mixed up in the wintertime.
Absolutely. Yeah. So what this person is asking about is totally the way that these grasses have spread, which is basically that in winter storms, the toe, or the part of the dune that's closest to the ocean, we call it the toe, it erodes and it'll rip up chunks of grass. And these grasses, although they're not that salt tolerant, if they float along in the ocean along the longshore current and then get washed back up onto the beach with a little bit of sand, they can reroot and spread. And so that's definitely how the 2 Ammophila beachgrasses have spread so dramatically outside of the areas where they were originally planted onto other beaches. And it's also a way that the hybrid could be spreading. There are a couple spots where I think that we have one clone of hybrid that has spread asexually by being ripped up and sort of passed down the beach. And we have a little bit of genetic evidence that some of our patches are one clone. But yeah, I'm in the middle of a project where I'm genotyping more of the hybrids to sort of a greater resolution to understand how are they related, how much are they spreading by this sort of drifting or getting eroded and then passed along, and how much are they spreading because new hybrid patches are being formed.
Great. Such an interesting process. I want to say that I have skipped over many compliments on your presentation. Exceptional presentation. Thank you. Thank you for being a champion of this. And so I wanted to make sure you had seen those. It was a really great presentation. And so we do have another question though. Do you think hybrids, do you think if the hybrid were back crossing with either of its parents that we'd be able to identify the offspring in the field by its armpit hair length, leaf width, etc.?
Oh, this is a really tricky question. So this person is asking if in fact the hybrid is sexually reproducing with the parent species and then producing more offspring. And we have something more that's called a hybrid swarm in the literature, where you have not just one Ammophila arenaria crossed with one Ammophila breviligulata and they make one baby, but sort of all of these sort of mixes up, where this one's 75% Ammophila arenaria and this one's 80% Ammophila breviligulata. Would we be able to identify those plants just by their morphology? I guess the answer is I hope so, but there's no way for me to know that, right? I hope that they would be different enough that we would notice them when we're out in the field. But it's not outside of the realm of possibility that I would not be able to identify that plant. Yeah, so far, the grasses that we've sequenced are definitely first generation crosses between the 2 parent species, which is an exciting discovery. And I'm not seeing a lot of the morphological intermediates that we would expect if there was backcrossing happening. Mm-hmm. So mostly we find hybrids that look like hybrids and parent species that look like parent species. Some of the traits for both species have wide variation, but we're really lucky that some of the traits have really small variation. So that Ligue length is like pretty good. It's like there's not a ton of variation in the 2 species and they don't overlap. And so anything that's like between them, we can sort of guess is a hybrid. But yeah, great question.
It really was a great question. Next question I'm also very interested in, so I'm glad it's being asked. Is there any sort of long-term eradication management plan for invasives? I'd imagine there are community groups with houses dependent on high dunes are against eradication. What's the long-term strategy, if any?
Yeah, that's a really good question. So the answer is really that the two Ammophila beachgrasses have built dunes that now the Oregon coast is extremely dependent upon. There are a lot of areas in the coast where we really could not remove beachgrasses without doing extreme damage to coastal communities. The good news is that researchers like my advisor and like Peter Ruggiero at OSU are working with land managers to identify areas where the dunes aren't really critical for coastal protection, but are where they're not really serving that ecosystem service, where we could do a sort of larger scale restoration or beachgrass removal project to restore native plants. The beachgrasses really dramatically outcompete native plants, and there are a lot of plants that are threatened and endangered because of them. I think that often gets kind of left out because people talk about snowy plovers, which we should absolutely talk about snowy plovers, but because they're so cute, sometimes we forget to talk about the plants too. Yeah, so there is interest in finding areas where beach restoration can happen. Some areas that you might think about where there has been restoration projects are up at Ledbetter Point at the very northern tip of the Long Beach Peninsula in Washington. There's been active management to increase habitat for snowy plovers for many years now, and that's involved just removing the beach grasses, but that removal has led to a lot of great consequences, including the return of the pink sand verbena, which now that I'm saying it, I'm not 100% sure that they didn't seed sand verbena there, so somebody should fact check me on that one. But regardless, when you remove the beach grasses, we already talked about seed banks. When you remove the beach grasses, native plants come back from the seed bank, even without being seeded. So that's a good place to think about. There's also areas in California where there's been a different land management strategy, which is instead of trying to get rid of, like, I'm showing this picture, right, of just a dense monoculture, instead of trying to get rid of that whole dense monoculture, what some areas have done is breach the foredune. So like basically take a backhoe and put a hole through the foredune and create what looks almost like a natural blowout in a dune. So pull all of the beach grass behind the foredune in this big circular area. And then native plants will return from the seed bank or can be seeded in there. These are all pretty management intensive and like person intensive for maintaining beach grass removal. But I do see a future where there will be more areas on the coast that are restored, especially for snowy plover habitat, but also for native plant conservation, and a lot of areas that just look the same way that they do now and are providing really valuable coastal protection.
That's super interesting. Kind of like areas, little kind of protected areas, protected dune areas in our future.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. That's super, super interesting. Well, Rebecca, I want to thank you for your time tonight and to say that I knew that I was excited about this presentation because I like this topic, but you just presented it so well and brought so many different things to light for me in such an entertaining way. So thank you so much for lending us your brain tonight and sharing all of this.
Great. Yeah, thank you so much for having me.
You're absolutely welcome. And we will keep everybody posted and share about any kind of upcoming opportunities to help collect research in this area. If anybody's interested, we'll certainly share it on our Facebook page. And you remember to go back into the chat and copy down Rebecca's information. We'll follow up with a email after this event, and we're included there too, so you can have multiple opportunities to engage. I do want to say that we do have another presentation coming up, and I'm going to put that up real quick. So I'm going to take over sharing the screen here. Our next presentation is on sharks. So we have sharks at the Oregon coast. So we're inviting a professor from Oregon State University to come and talk about the different shark species off our coastline. His work is around studying these populations and helping to shift kind of our perceptions of sharks as these kind of, you know, human eating dangerous animals to more of appreciation and inspiration. So if you're interested in learning more about these fish species, large fish species off our coastline, then you can join this, this virtual presentation on May 6th. All of the information is online and you can find it at our website, www.netartsbaywebs.org. And so with that, if you have any lingering questions, you can certainly drop an email to either of us. And we will make sure it gets in the right hands and gets your questions answered. And Rebecca, I hope that we run into you again. And I hope that we can recruit some Netarts Bay people to get out there and help on Bay Ocean Spit and the Netart Spit too.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks, everyone.
Yeah, everyone have a wonderful evening and thanks again for joining us.